Here I again. This is part two. So I'm back again. This is your old friend Zeke, and we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and the age of Jackson when he becomes the seventh president of the United States. Well, short time before this inaugural party would happen, and he would be inaugurated as president of the United States, something tragic happened in Andrew Jackson's life. Not that his whole life wasn't tragic. He had a tragic life from when he was just a youngster being caught by the British during that war that we called the Revolution. Back in 1776, he was caught as a youngster and he was not treated very well. He had two brothers he lost in that war, and his mother died during that war. And he was probably about 14 years old when he was captured as a messenger. Luckily, he wasn't a spy because they would have hung him. But now, here it is, 1828, 1829, when he's going to be put into office. His wife Rachel died. Now, that was a sad thing, folks. So I want to take a little bit of time just to tell you a story, just a little bit about um, Andrew Jackson and Rachel. Rachel was married. I'm not going back to the very beginnings and all her doings. You can look that up. Rachel was married to a man named Louis Robards at the age of 18 years old. Yes, she was. All right. By all accounts, it was the most unhappy marriage. Okay. By this time, Rachel's father had died. Her mother had returned to Nashville. We're talking about Tennessee now. Tennessee, where I'm at, Tennessee. After separating several times from her husband, Rachel eventually moved to her mother's house in Tennessee. Now, he tried to get her back. But you see, I believe he was a little abusive to her. Yes, he was. He was a little abusive to her, and he drank a little too much. She didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. Now, she was a young girl. Well, there was a young lawyer around that parts. His name was Andrew Jackson. Recently arrived from North Carolina. He was boarding with her mother, Rachel's mother, when Rachel arrived. Love at first sight. It was love at first sight. So the attraction between them was just immediately like that. Believing her first husband had divorced her. Did he? Well, he said he did. Rachel went to visit her friends near Natchez, and Jackson accompanied her on the journey. Now, he thought they were already divorced, but they might not have been. Well, in Natchez, they got married. Now, wait a second now. You can't marry somebody if they're already married. Rachel said they were divorced, and the papers were already filed. So it was fine for them to get married then, wasn't it? Yes, it is. It is fine. Divorce was not very common back in these days. Not very common at all. But they thought they had a handle on it. Got to realize who her ex-husband really was. He had a lot of influence in the people in that area. Because Rachel's marriage to Robards had really not been legally dissolved, then the marriage to Andrew Jackson was technically invalid, not good, can happen. Well, they didn't know about that. They didn't know about that. They just went on to marry lives. When the couple returned to Nashville in 1791, now Rachel had already been about 26 years old. They learned that Robards initiated the divorce proceedings like she thought, and she thought that they were put in and taken care of. He never turned the papers in. Uh-oh. He never filed the papers. So he started the divorce proceedings, but he never officially filed the papers. So technically, they were still married. Wow. Do you think that's an awkward situation? Eventually, him and Jackson have words. Yes, they do. Now, he don't kill them. They don't kill each other. They have words, and they make sure that them papers are filed. Well, they have to get married again, and they do. They get married a second time. So he married his wife Rachel twice. And that's some people still do that. Yes, they do. You know. So Louis Robards is out of the picture now. And I think later on he died anyway. So now Rachel and Andrew can have their own life by themselves. After Jackson's return to Washington, Rachel's health, now I'm jumping way ahead. I'm not going to go all through their lives. Rachel's health began to decline. She was sickly. Yes, she was sickly. So he left her many times to go on the road and as a judge, when he was a judge, and then he became a senator. As he did things, uh, he'd come back to her and she'd be sick. She'd be very sick. But she masked it a lot. In other words, she didn't tell him all the time how sick she was. The servants knew how sick she was. As in the case with most 19th century diagnoses of how sick she was, it was difficult to really understand what Rachel's exact condition was. Many believe it was just cancer, is what it was, because her illness seemed to center around her heart and lungs. So it could have been some type of a cancer. Whatever it was terminal. And she knew it. She knew it was happening. So as Jackson began his campaign to gain the White House, personal and political attacks would mount. And you know what they started throwing out there? They dig into everything, folks. They dug into his past and found out, so you and your said wife were living in sin. She was married, and you were living with her. Uh-oh. That don't come out too good, especially not in the 1800s. Stress and depression started to compound her existing health conditions. It made her even worse. She worried about things. Well, just after Andrew Jackson won the presidential election, Rachel's final downturn in her illness began. She died December 22nd, 1828. 1828. Her death devastated Andrew Jackson. It would anybody. Anybody would be devastated. Even though her sickness began as early as 1825, he always blamed his political enemies for her death. Yes, the stress that they put on her in the newspapers and in their speeches, he blamed his political enemies for the death of his wife. In some ways, he may have been right. He may have been right. Now, what about kids? They never had any kids of their own. No, they didn't. But they did adopt a son. Andrew Jackson Jr., they named him. Born December 4th, 1808, in Davidson, Tennessee, and died in April 17th, 1865, the year the Great War would end, in Tennessee. He actually was adopted from Rachel's brother. He was a twin. Yes, he was. He was a twin. Now, I don't know the circumstances why they had to adopt him, but they did, and they raised him as their own, even gave him a new name, Andrew Jackson Jr. Wow. Her brother was Severn, name was Severn Donaldson. That was her brother's name. And since both of his parents were alive at the time, the reason he was given to them is not clear. Now, Jackson, even though he was in a lot of Indian fights, he adopted an Indian boy. Maybe not on the best circumstances because they went through the Indian village during a battle and wiped everybody out. Mostly all men, women, and children. But there was this young, very young boy, baby actually, that was laying there. I believe he was around 1.5, 2 years old. His mother had been killed. Jackson picked him up and he raised him as his own. His name, Lincoya Jackson. He was born in 1811 and he died 1828. So, Um, they also were guardians of 6 other children. Guardians. In other words, they helped take care of 6 other children. There was always children in the house. Always children in the house. None of them were actually biological then. But you can be a mom and a dad to somebody as long as you love them. And you raise them the right way. They don't have to be your biological mom and dad, but you know who they are, your mom and dad, don't you? Yes, yes, you do. And a lot of times things happen like that. It's just a good thing that somebody's there for you, isn't it? And Jacksons were there for all them children. That was a great thing they did. Now, let's get to something that's really interesting, okay? Even though, even though he went through all that with his wife, he still had to be inaugurated as president of the United States. Yes, he did, because that's his job now. And there's usually a party that goes on at the White House, an inaugural ball where all the important people come, and usually you're invited by a specific invitation. Well, Jackson's going to have that too, but not just the important people. The important people to him were everybody. I was there. Zeke was there. Yes, I was. Anybody and anybody could come, and we could be at that party, and we were there at the party. Now, as Jackson walked in, I mean, they had him behind some type of a rope. That rope broke. There were so many people. Some estimate between 10 and 20,000 people. I don't know. I couldn't look back that far, but there was a lot of people there. Okay. As the rope fell down, people started to go across the yard, and some men had to grab Jackson and take him out of the way. They took him out of the way. Things were getting out of hand. There was music going on. They had more than sarsaparilla. They had drinks there, alcohol. You know, them Southern boys make their own kind of stuff, and it's quite potent. So things were happening in the White House that should never happen. Things were getting broken. Furniture was getting broken. People were wandering all through the rooms. They had to take Jackson out and take him to a hotel. He couldn't even stay at the White House. That's terrible. So how'd they get them people out of the White House? Listen to this now. They had big tubs of alcohol, and they put them out in the yard with some food, and they enticed the people to come out, and then they locked the doors. By that time, the house was destroyed inside. I mean, it would take them for a long time to fix that up. Can you imagine being a servant trying to clean up after that kind of party? That is the biggest party I've ever seen. It really was. When they got up in the morning, people were passed out. There had been fights that were going on. Well, listen, I'm going to tell you what one person says. Now, this lady was there. This lady was there. I mean, I've seen things myself. It was unbelievable, but I got out of there. I went with Jackson. I knew it was going to get bad, so I went with him. I stayed at the hotel. This lady said this. Ladies fainted. Men were seen with bloody noses. I've seen some of them. And such a scene of confusion took place, it's an impossible to describe. Ladies and gentlemen had only been expected to come to this party, but it was the people's day, and the people's president, and the people would rule, and they did. Wow. Some Americans viewed these events as a bad omen. They said wherever he goes, there's a mob of people, and there is craziness. They started calling him the reign of King Mob. They called him King Mob. Yes, they did. Jackson, however, saw this signal as, listen, we're getting back to reality again, and I'm letting the people know this is their country, not just mine. And the government's not going to rule it, they're going to rule it. Guess what, folks? That's what the Constitution says. They work for us. They work for us. The president on the way down. So when them people start telling you things, you got to realize, you're working for us. I'm paying your wage. So if I'm paying you, when does the employee tell the employer what to do? Something got to change. Got to keep an eye on that. Okay? Now, there are some rewards for victory. There's rewards for victory. In a battle, when you take over the enemy, whatever they have is now yours. It's called the spoils of war. Whatever they had is now yours. And Jackson is going to do this. You know that when a president comes in, he can tell that old cabinet, go bye. You're gone. I'm putting my own cabinet in. I'm picking my own people. And he did. So people that did him favors while he was running for president and some relatives and friends, they got some pretty nice jobs. Yes, they did. They got nice jobs. Are you allowed to do that? Well, whether you're allowed to or not, people are doing it. People do it. Yes, they do. In businesses, in politics. If you know somebody, chances you got a better chance of getting a job than somebody don't know somebody that's high up there, right? They call this the spoil system. So listen to this real close now. Jackson handed out more political jobs to his supporters than any president before him. Anyone before him. Changing office holders, um, changing people that were in his cabinet, everybody that was running messages for him, the people that were doing highfalutin jobs. The practice was known as the spoil system, and they're still doing it today. They still do it today. Yes, they do. Jackson angered many people by relying upon a group of his own advisors, too. Now, he had a whole cabinet back there that people were supposed to sit down in a big room and, talk about things, which he did. He did talk to his cabinet. But he had friends that he could trust that would sit around his kitchen table. They called him the kitchen cabinet. The kitchen cabinet, kind of catchy, isn't it? Kitchen cabinet. Not the kind that hangs on the wall, folks. No. It's the kind that sits around your table and you ask your friends, what do you think I should do? Now, when your friends ask you a real important question, what do you think I should do? What are you going to tell them? You can tell them the truth. You can tell them what they need to hear. There's a problem right there. You need somebody to scratch you once in a while like sandpaper. You need somebody to tell you what the truth is, and not just tell you what you want to hear. Because you want to be able to do the right thing. But he believed that he could seek approval and advice from his kitchen cabinet. Jackson turned a deaf ear to critics when they said, you have to start listening to these men that are in the real cabinet. Here's what he says. I do precisely what I think is right and just. I'll do it myself. Nobody's going to tell Jackson what to do. He's going to do it. Remember what his nickname is? Old Hickory. Who's going to tell him what to do? And now he's president of the United States. Was he going to do a good job? I'm going to let you decide if he does a good job or not. Okay? This bank that we have, this bank, all right, Jackson goes after the Bank of the United States. Well, why? Let me read it to you. In 1832, Jackson felt it just and right to go to battle with the Bank of the United States. He just feels just and right to do it. Debate had surrounded the banks ever since its creation. In 1816, remember the Second National Bank, the first one, 1811, it was gone, and they brought it back, Monroe, in 1816. The federal government deposited all of its money in the bank. All of it. Everything. As a result, the bank had complete control over everybody's credit. Everybody's credit. Now, if you knew somebody and you were a governor of a state, you might get more money. If the banker didn't like you as much, you won't get as much money. How are your people going to prosper in that state? There's a problem. It also decided how much money each state bank would receive. So friendship goes a long way. It's called greasing that palm, isn't it? You got to be greasing somebody's palm all the time. That's politics, folks. That's politics. It ain't right all the time. It isn't. It isn't. A lot of times your handshake or your word isn't your word. Well, old Zeke, it is. I shake your hand. That's a deal. I don't need to sign a piece of paper. That's a deal. When I tell you something, I mean it. Politicians don't. They talk to you straight in the face, and they say, well, I really mean it. And as soon as you're gone, no, I don't. I just told him what he wanted to hear. Well, how do you work with people like that? You just can't. You just can't work with people like that. So, farmers and merchants hated the bank because they weren't getting any money that they needed to plant crops, to buy supplies. How are they supposed to stay in business? Well, you got to be greasing somebody's palm. They didn't have the money to grease anybody's palm. They couldn't do enough favors to get their stuff. Andrew Jackson felt the same way. Yes, he did. He felt the same way about that. So he focuses his anger on the president of the bank. His name is Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle had been the bank president since 1823. 1823. You just imagine what he might have looked like. You just imagine. Anyway, he was represented by the power of the wealthy Eastern uh, industrialists. He actually came from a well-to-do Philadelphia family, not like Jackson. He was born in a log cabin. The first president born in a log cabin, matter of fact. Yes, he was. And Jackson viewed him with distaste. Didn't like him. Didn't like him at all. Now, the two headstrong leaders finally tangled in 1832. And here's the reason why. That year, Biddle, the president of the bank, asked Congress to renew the bank's charter. In other words, Congress has to approve of this every so often. Well, the charter really wasn't up until 1836. Well, why are you asking me all the way now in 1832? We want to make sure that we get a jump on this. We want to get a jump on this. Okay. Henry Clay would run against Jackson for president in 1832. See, he became president in 1828. Jackson did. 4 years next, 1832. Henry Clay, who used to be the Speaker of the House, is going to run against Jackson for president. He saw the bank as a way to unseat Jackson. I'm going to get him. I'm going to stick him because he's a politician wise. You understand? If Jackson signed a congressional bill to renew the bank for their charter, he would lose the votes in the South from them farmers and merchants down there and people from the West that needed that money too. On the other hand, if he vetoed the bank bill, on the other hand, Jackson would, if he signed a congressional bill to renew the bank, he'd lose it. But if he said no, then he's going to lose all the votes in the North. Oh my goodness, I'm getting confused already. So either way, whether he renews it or whether he vetoes it, he's going to lose votes. If he renews it, he loses all the votes in the South and West. If he vetoes it, he loses all the votes in the North. So what you going to do? He's got to do something. Clay skillfully pushed this bill through Congress like we've seen today. We've seen there's been things pushed through Congress, and they ain't right. They ain't right. You understand? Jackson was sick. He laid sick in his bed till the news reached him about what Clay was doing. He had people out there. Yes, he did. He had people out there. So listen here what Clay is going to try to do. He goes to the president and says, so you can sign this now. Here it comes. However, to veto the bank renew bill and change the bank would be corrupt and anti-American. He did this. So he did not accept the bank charter. It went down. He didn't care what them people in the North said. Clay said, you have to renew it. He said, nope. He said, if you don't, it's anti-American. He goes, no, it's not. This is what we're going to do. We're going to veto it. So back to Congress it goes. It's got to get 2/3 of a vote. It's not going to get it. It's not going to get it. And the bank charter goes down. Now they're still good. They're still good for a while. Biddle said the president's charges had all the fury of a chained panther biting at the bars of his cage. And it did. However, he soon found that panther would be on the loose. Because in 1832 election, Henry Clay don't win, folks. No, Andrew Jackson wins again by a landslide, a sweeping victory. The people like Jackson. He's getting things done. He's getting it done. Jackson promptly orders Secretary of Treasury Roger Taney. Roger Taney, remember that name now, because we're going to be talking about him later. Roger Taney. He says, I want you to put federal funds into certain state banks. Certain state banks. Instead of putting it all in that federal bank, I want you to put the money that we get into the federal treasury here in certain state banks all around the country. They called them banks pet banks. Pet banks. Understand? Roger Taney did that. Biddle struck back by restricting the flow of money into a lot of these states. See, he was vengeful. He got vengeful. Paper money became so scarce that a financial crisis seemed likely. Seemed likely. But it wasn't going to happen. Not yet. The loss of federal funds crippled the bank. And in 1836, when the charter was actually up, it went out of business because they ran out of money. They ran out of money. It was out of business, folks. It was out of business. Wow. So, I'm going to ask you a few questions here and see what you think, because I told you, I'm not going to tell you all of Zeke's opinions. What do you think that spoil system is? You remember? So ask yourself, what is the spoil system? You know what it is? It is hiring those that supported you, your friends, your relatives, in jobs that other people could apply for. That's the spoil system. What was the kitchen cabinet? They were his friends that would become his advisors. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? I know you got to have friends around, but you got to listen to all sides. What is pet banks? I just got done telling you what pet banks are. That's where they put the federal funds in certain state banks around the country called pet banks. So how did Jackson defend that spoil system that he had? I'll do what is just and right. And that's it. Case closed. He did what he wanted to. Who's going to tell him? Remember his nickname? Old Hickory. So we know how Jackson destroyed the banking United States. And how did he do it? He vetoed their charter. He vetoed the charter. And he won the election the same year. How about that? How about that? So would you agree or not agree with that spoil system? Back to that again. Sometimes it's best to leave relatives, find another job. Ain't it? It could cause some hard feelings. Take Adams and Jefferson when we started this whole thing. They were best of friends. But when they were working real close together, it didn't work out too well for them, did it? No, it didn't. Now, when it came down to this banking thing, is it all done and said for? Not yet, folks. Not yet. Who was the one that started that? Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton, way back in the day of George Washington. So, when's it going to come back? You're going to have to just keep watching to find out. You have to watch to find out. It's going to make a comeback. Because we have something today called even the Federal Reserve. I'll throw all kinds of names out there. But we have to describe every single one of them as we go along. That's how you learn the history. Well, guess what? Part 2 is done. It is done. We are going to come into another part that is going to be extraordinary. Jackson's second term. Now, historically, your second terms usually don't go as good as the first term. A lot of presidents have seen it that way. Remember what Jefferson said? I feel great getting rid of these shackles that I've had of all this power. I want to go back home. And he did. He could have run a third time, but he didn't. Washington could have run a third time. No, twice was enough. That's 8 years of your life. 8 years. It's a good thing. 8 years long enough. So what's Jackson going to do in the next 4 years? From 32 to 1836. Some of it's good. Some of it ain't too good. But you know what? As always, I'm going to let you decide. So today, I'm going to end it like I always do. Be kind out there. Be kind. Be nice. Don't need to be angry. Do not be afraid. Do not have that spirit of fear. You don't need to be afraid. Stand up for yourself. And those people, them that love you, what are you supposed to tell them? You tell them that you love them. And you come on back and see Zeke again because we got some exciting things to talk about with Andrew Jackson's second term in 1832. We'll see y'all.